Something that clearly stands out when looking at the past four presidential elections, 2020, 2016, 2012, and 2008, is how strong the southern United States has voted for the Republican Party. You can see in the 2020 election, Donald Trump carried 9 of the 11 former states of the Confederate States of America. In 2016, he carried 10 out of 11. In 2012, Mitt Romney carried 9 out of the 11, and in 2008, John McCain carried 8 of the 11 former Confederate states. So it is pretty clear that as of now, the Confederacy, or the former Confederacy, is a very strong area for the Republican Party. However, this wasn't always the case, as early on in the 1940s and 50s and early 60s, the Democratic Party's strongest area in the United States was the South. The transition of the South from a Democratic stronghold to a Republican stronghold has been studied by many political scientists, and many people have identified the 1964 presidential election as a turning point in the South's political history, going from a Democrat to a Republican stronghold. While it is true that the 1964 election was clearly a turning point, the South as a whole did not actually go red in this election, despite the deep South states of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana voting for Barry Goldwater by landslide margins. The rest of the South actually voted for LBJ, and LBJ actually won the former Confederacy by a margin of 50% to 48%. While this was certainly a lot worse than many past Democrats, this wasn't the first election where the South went red. So in this video, we're going to be analyzing when and why did the South actually go Republican. So there is actually not a consensus on what the South actually is. Many people have claimed that the South goes all the way from Delaware to Oklahoma, and it basically consists of any area that was a former slave state. However, I disagree with this. I don't think Maryland and Delaware count as southern states because they just have way too much mid-Atlantic and northern influence, and I don't think Oklahoma, at least the whole of the entire state of Oklahoma, is a part of the South. I would argue that the South consists of part of West Virginia as well as all of Virginia except for the very northern part that is connected to Washington, D.C., pretty much all of Kentucky except for the Louisville and areas near Cincinnati, as well as eastern Texas and southeastern Oklahoma, and I would argue southern Missouri is also a part of the South. And as for Florida, I would say that the northern part of Florida can be considered a part of the South. However, the rest of Florida isn't really culturally tied to the South as the northern part of Florida is. And then the entire states of North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia are all part of the South. So you also have to analyze that there were many different kinds of Southern voters during this period in the 20th century. There were Southern voters who were already voting Republican and had been voting Republican for generations because they were part of historically Unionist parts of their states. This includes eastern Tennessee, as well as northeastern Arkansas, as well as western North Carolina, and largely parts of Appalachia that were historically very Unionist. There were also many of the more poor white Southerners who, while they were certainly concerned with racial issues, they were more concerned with economic issues than they were with racial issues. These were largely Southerners in many states that were secession states, such as South Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama. They were voters in the more northern parts of these states who were more concerned with economics than they were with race. And they were very tied to the Democratic Party because they were the strongest supporters of FDR. Then you have many of the wealthy Southerners who did not have the same economic concerns that this group had. They were largely based in the parts of the Black Belt that had more African Americans than whites, and thus racial issues were their main concern rather than a secondary concern. And the idea of race relations instead of economics was the main concern of these voters, who were largely wealthier whites in the Black Belt part of the South. Then there were African Americans who were largely disenfranchised and were unable to vote until 1968. So let's get into this. In the 1928 election, this is where we really saw the first cracks in the Solid South, where Herbert Hoover was able to win the states of Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Florida, as well as Texas. However, when it comes to the areas that were actually considered as part of the South, such as North Florida and East Texas, these were all areas that went to Al Smith by comfortable margins, despite the sizable anti-Catholic prejudice against Al Smith. And this was arguably the key reason why the South went to Hoover rather than Al Smith, which was anti-Catholic prejudice. In fact, Herbert Hoover did extremely well in the state of Alabama compared to past Republican nominees, coming within 2 points of flipping the state. However, in some other states such as Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, Smith was able to win by comfortable margins. And Al Smith actually won the majority of former Confederates in these states, despite it being an extraordinarily narrow margin. He still won the South as a whole. However, this was the first election where there were really cracks starting to form. But these cracks weren't really that big, considering how FDR came in 1932, and the Deep South and the South as a whole was actually FDR's strongest area in the entire country, and in his 4 landslide victories, the South was reliable for him. And he had many allies in the South who, while they were segregationists, they did largely support the economically liberal policies of the Roosevelt administration. In 1948, a misconception is that the South went for Strom Thurmond over Harry Truman because of Truman's stance on desegregation. However, Truman actually did very well in the South, and he won states such as Georgia, Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, Florida, North Carolina, and Virginia. And the only states that he lost were Thurman's home state of South Carolina, as well as 3 other very deep South states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And when you look at this faction that went for Strom Thurmond, they actually later on in 1952 and 1956 backed Dwight Eisenhower over Adlai Stevenson's, which really shows that many of these Southern voters, especially the Southern voters in the Black Belt, had lost their past allegiance to the Democratic Party and were willing to vote elsewhere. They didn't have the same economic concerns that many other Southern voters had, which caused them to vote Democrat. In fact, they were largely more fiscally conservative than the average Southerner at the time, and with race relations being their primary issue and the Democratic Party moving very leftward on racial issues, as well as other social issues as a whole during this time period, it would make sense why they would consider other options. In fact, during the 1952 and 56 elections, Republicans did well in these areas of Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina. As you can see, they did well in the Black Belt portion of Alabama. They didn't win that many counties, but they did pretty well regarding the margins. And in fact, in Jefferson County, Alabama, which is where Birmingham is, they actually won the county as a whole. And then you go to Mississippi, where they won a lot of these counties around the Black Belt, and they won Hinds County, Mississippi, which is where Jackson, Mississippi is. And they also won a lot of the a lot of the low country of South Carolina, as well as even Greenville. And this is largely because of their win in Charleston, which was one of the biggest slave cities during the 1800s. These trends in which the South was gradually becoming more and more Republican didn't start in 1964. They started in the 1950s and earlier on in 1948, when despite doing pretty badly in the region with regards to electoral college, Dewey actually did quite well in the South compared to past Republicans. And if you actually look at the popular vote of the South in the 1948 election, Dewey actually did better than Strom Thurmond, despite not winning any electoral votes. And then we head on to the other states in the South, such as Virginia and Texas, which don't really have as much of a Southern reputation as, per se, Alabama and Mississippi. But you do see that there are in many ways cracks forming in these more historically slave-holding parts of the South, such as in this area of Virginia, which is the eastern shore of Virginia, as well as parts of eastern Texas, which were starting to flip Republican, despite the region as a whole actually going towards the Democrats. The states of Mississippi and South Carolina actually decided to vote for third-party candidates in many ways in the 1956 election. The states as a whole went to Adlai Stevenson's, but there were third-party candidates and unpledged electors in the state in 1956, and many of these unpledged electors had support from former supporters of Dwight Eisenhower in 1952. And what changed? It was Eisenhower's support of desegregating a school in Little Rock, Arkansas, that made many Southerners who previously trusted Dwight Eisenhower believe him to be untrustworthy on the issue of race relations, which was in many ways the primary issue of these voters in the cotton parts of these states where there were more African Americans than whites. So the main area where Republicans started to gain in the South during the 1950s was in the Black Belt, where there was a higher population of African Americans than whites. In the 1960 election, it was a race between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, and just like Al Smith before him, Kennedy, of course, faced discrimination because he was a Catholic in the heavily Protestant South. Despite winning the region as a whole, if you actually look to how the South trended from 1956 to 1960 and compare that shift to the rest of the country as a whole, you would see that the entire South, minus the state of Louisiana, trended towards the Republicans and Richard Nixon. The state of Mississippi voted for third-party candidate Harry Byrd, so it's not exactly clear to say how the state would have shifted otherwise. However, it likely would have shifted heavily towards Nixon, even if Byrd wasn't on the ballot. So now we see that in many ways in the 1960 election, there were heavy gains among Republicans in the Black Belt. They were winning parts of the Low Country in South Carolina, which was historically a very fertile area for agriculture, cotton, as well as the enslavement of African Americans. They were also winning a lot in western Tennessee, which was a primary area of slavery in the state of Tennessee, as opposed to the eastern area, which was always Republican because of the lack of slavery and its strong support for the Union. And then in Alabama, Jefferson County remained supportive of Richard Nixon, and there were gains being made in the Black Belt. And as for the state of Mississippi, the strongest areas for Harry Byrd were the Black Belt. So as we can see here, the Black Belt, which is the area of the South that consists of more African Americans than whites, was the area during this time that was the first part that shifted towards the Republican Party during the 1950s and the 1960 presidential election. And during this time, because African Americans weren't able to vote in the South, the white voters of the Black Belt decided to vote Republican because they didn't view the Democratic Party as trustworthy regarding racial issues. And then in 1962, there was a huge warning sign from Democrats when John Tower, who ran as a conservative Republican, won the state of Texas in 1962. He won the Senate election there. He succeeded their majority leader, Lyndon Johnson, who went on to become vice president. This was a huge warning for the Democrats in the South, and this continued in the 1964 election, where Goldwater flipped the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. This was, in fact, the first state where Georgia voted Republican. This was the first time ever where Georgia voted Republican in any presidential election. And when you look at the overall shifts from 1960 to 1964, especially if you compare them to the shifts of the nation as a whole, the entire South got redder, with the exception of Texas, which was LBJ's home state. And when you look at what gave Barry Goldwater these wins, he won every single county in the state of Mississippi, but his strongest counties were the counties surrounding the Mississippi River, which was the most fertile area of the state, where there was the highest portion of blacks to whites, and many of these black voters could not vote, so the white voters in the Black Belt broke for Goldwater. We also saw this, as you can see, in the state of Louisiana. Every single county that is bordering the Mississippi River voted for Goldwater, and in the state of South Carolina, the entire Low Country supported Goldwater. In Alabama, the same can be said, as the Black Belt was Goldwater's strongest area. And then in the state of Florida, you actually saw a flip from 1956, where upstate Florida was actually largely loyal, and the Panhandle was largely loyal to the Democrats, voting for them in 1952 and 56, and even supporting Al Smith in 1928 and Kennedy in 1960. However, unlike last time, the Panhandle decided to flip towards the Republicans. What ultimately saved LBJ from losing the state of Florida was that Democrats made huge gains in the southern portion of the state, which was less tied towards the south. And in the state of Georgia, this was the first time Georgia ever went red, the Black Belt parts of Georgia were the key area where Goldwater outperformed. When you look at the parts where Goldwater underperformed among Southerners, it was in the working class parts of upstate South Carolina, southwestern Louisiana, northeastern Mississippi, as well as northern Alabama, which were afraid of Goldwater's fiscal conservatism, which they feared would eliminate many of the programs that were designed to help them from the federal government. This also included northeastern Georgia. And we see this even further in the states of Tennessee and North Carolina, where in Tennessee, a large portion of the state decided to vote for Johnson over Goldwater because they feared that Goldwater would eliminate the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a key way how they would get electricity and the supplies they needed in the state of Tennessee. And in North Carolina, despite the northeastern part of the state having a huge African American population, the white voters decided to loyally vote for the Democrats because they were largely more poor than other white voters in other parts of the Black Belt. And they continued this in 1964 because they did not like Goldwater's strand of fiscal conservatism. Strom Thurmond also switched parties during the 1964 presidential election, going from a Democrat to a Republican because he did not like the way the Democratic Party was heading. However, he was the only Southerner to change parties during this time in the United States Senate or the House of Representatives. And then here comes 1968. In 1968, George Wallace won a lot of the Deep South, and one of the key arguments that is in favor of Nixon by Nixon defenders who claim that he wasn't using a Southern strategy because Wallace was anyway going to win the South anyways. This is actually not true because despite losing many of the Deep South states of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Louisiana, as well as an Upper South state of Arkansas, Nixon actually did win a few Southern states. This includes Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, as well as Florida, and he actually almost won Texas and was making a play for Texas. So, in these states of North Carolina, which was a state where Nixon won narrowly, the eastern part of the state, which was loyal to Democrats in 64, 60, 56, and 52, decided it had had enough, and many of the white voters there, who were largely economically poor, voted for George Wallace because, unlike Barry Goldwater, George Wallace was not a firm fiscal conservative, and George Wallace was largely supportive of maintaining federal programs for many people in poverty, and thus with the people of northeastern North Carolina largely supporting George Wallace's economic policies as well as his policy on race relations, they ultimately broke for George Wallace. However, Nixon still won white voters as a whole because he had a strong support in the eastern, more historically unionist part of the state, and he made gains in many suburban parts of North Carolina, such as the suburban parts of Raleigh and the suburban parts of Charlotte. As for the state of Florida, Richard Nixon made gains in southern Florida. However, George Wallace won the Panhandle by a landslide. And as for the state of Tennessee, all of western Tennessee, except for the city of Memphis, which its county where ultimately in this election also African Americans had the right to vote, but George Wallace did extremely well in Western Tennessee as well as Middle Tennessee, but Nixon was overall able to win the state because of his strong support in Eastern Tennessee. And then as for the state of South Carolina, much of the Low Country actually went to Hubert Humphrey this time, but this was largely because, unlike in the past elections where it was only white voters, this time African American voters in the Low Country were given voting rights. And if African American voters were disenfranchised, I do believe that all of the Low Country would have gone for George Wallace. However, Nixon was able to do quite well in the upstate and even do pretty good among working class Southerners during this time. However, one of the key groups that broke for Nixon in the South that ultimately gave him the edge in many of these states in this election were suburban Southerners. In the 1972 election, Nixon won the entire nation by a landslide. The only state he lost was Massachusetts, and he also lost Washington, D.C. And if you look at the 5 strongest counties for Richard Nixon in the 1972 election, it was Dade County, Georgia, Glasscock County, Georgia, George County, Mississippi, Holmes County, Florida, and Smith County, Mississippi. All 5 of these counties went to George Wallace in 1968, and ultimately the strongest state for Richard Nixon was the state of Mississippi, where he had lost by a landslide 4 years earlier in 1968, and this time the state of Mississippi backed him, with apparently white voters voting for Nixon by close to 100%. That's right, 100%. And it also shows with counties, like for example, Nixon was able to flip the Florida panhandle and gained a strong amount of support there. He also won every single county in Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, and South Carolina. And Oklahoma, which is technically not a part of the South, but the southeastern portion of Oklahoma, which is known as Little Dixie, can be considered a part of the South. Nixon previously lost these areas to JFK in 1960 and George Wallace in 1968. This was an area that was also loyal to Democrats for a while. However, now it decided enough was enough, and it backed Richard Nixon in 1972. Nixon also did quite well in South Carolina and made gains in the more working-class upstate. In 1976, Jimmy Carter did very well in the South, and this was pretty obvious considering how he was a Southern Democrat and actually largely supported and was, in fact, in many ways, the average voter in the South resonated heavily with Carter considering how he was a peanut farmer and he was also the governor of Georgia. And when you look at the margins he had in each state, these were pretty substantial margins, winning Tennessee, Arkansas, and Georgia by over 15 points, and also winning states such as Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Florida, as well as Virginia. However, again, if you use the shift method, which we used last time, you would see that as a whole, compared to the shift of the rest of the country, the South actually largely trended towards the right. And if you actually take the white voters of each of the southern states and you were to maintain that the South was still racially segregated, then Gerald Ford actually won a majority of the southern states with only white voters voting. So in this video, we're trying to analyze what made white Southerners go Republican and when they went Republican. And in this election, we can already see that many white Southerners in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Virginia backed Ford by landslide margins, despite Carter being one of them. And the only states where Carter was really able to win a majority of white Southerners were Georgia, which is where he was from, as well as Arkansas and Tennessee, which he won very narrowly. In the 1980 election, it featured Ronald Reagan, who was in many ways a conservative Republican, similar to Barry Goldwater, but except a lot more charismatic and likable, running against Jimmy Carter, who by this time was much more unpopular. And Reagan actually won the South very narrowly compared to the rest of the nation. However, again, if you only look at white voters in the South, you would see he won them by a landslide overall. And the only state which he lost was Georgia, which again was Carter's home state. So by this time, it appears many white Southerners were backing the Republican Party. And then in 1984, just like Nixon in just like Nixon did in 1960 and 1972. Basically, Reagan swept the entire nation and only lost Minnesota and Washington, D.C., and the same can be said about the South. However, unlike 1972, where Nixon, the strongest region of the country for Nixon was the South, Reagan's strongest area was largely the West. And the South, he won by largely 20 points per se. And as we can see here, what was once the strongest area of the South for Republicans, which was the Black Belt, as well as the Low Country of South Carolina, the Black Belt of Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama, was now their weakest area because African American voters were now enfranchised and were voting Democrat. And their strongest areas now were largely the areas surrounding it. And they actually did quite well now with Republican working class voters as well as Republican suburban voters. However, they still weren't doing as well with white working class voters in the South as they are now, and you can see this in northeastern Mississippi, northern Alabama, parts southeastern Georgia, as well as northeastern South Carolina, as well as parts of northwestern South Carolina, where as a whole Republicans were struggling among more working class white voters. In 1988, George H.W. Bush did extremely well and actually kind of did better than Reagan in the South. And in 1992, however, Bill Clinton flipped many southern states from George H.W. Bush, and George H.W. Bush's strong support in 1988 among Southerners largely had to do with the portrayal of sorry about that, had to do with the portrayal of Michael Dukakis as a liberal Massachusetts man, and in this case, the same could not be said about Bill Clinton, who is from Arkansas. And when you look at it, the key areas where Republicans struggled in the South were the working class areas of northeastern North Carolina, for example, as well as the working class parts of Middle Tennessee. This was a key concern for Republicans who, despite gaining a lot of ground in the South, they still weren't able to max out support among white working class Southerners. And you also saw in the states of Mississippi and Alabama, which despite Bush and later Dole were able to win these states, ultimately, again, it was the working class parts of northern Alabama as well as northeastern Mississippi that gave some support to Bill Clinton, as well as the African American voters in the Black Belt. So, ultimately, Republicans were able to gain massive ground with white suburban voters, but were not able to do the same with more working class white voters in the South. However, this began to change in 2000, where George W. Bush did much better among white working class voters in the South. However, it wasn't enough to fully max out the margins. But this changed in 2004 and 2008, where the Democrat nominees were John Kerry and Barack Obama. To say the least, these two candidates were as un-Southern as it could get, and many of the white working class voters in the South decided to back the Republicans. Also, with Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again movement largely appeasing many white working class voters across the Midwest as well as the South, the whole populist messaging gave many white voters in the South much more appeasement with the Republican Party. And this also has to do largely with economics again, which is, despite pastly with the Republicans being much more fiscally conservative and Democrats being much more pro-worker and fiscally liberal, many white working class voters decided to back the Democratic Party. However, with NAFTA and there being basically the perception that there was little to no difference between the Democrats and Republicans on economic issues, they decided to shift more towards the social issues. And when it came to social issues such as gay marriage, abortion, and issues such as this, the average voter in the South, especially a white working class voter, was much more supportive of the Republican Party's stance. So ultimately, the emerging prevalence of social issues over economic issues If you were to simplify it, the prevalence of social issues such as race relations and later abortion and gay marriage were what gave the Republican Party the South. And interestingly enough, the suburban voters of the South and the wealthier voters of the South, who were the first to go Republican, have now actually been shifting Democrat, with more people from the North moving down south in suburban areas, such as suburban Charlotte, suburban Georgia, as suburban Virginia. They're now voting Democrat more so, which is interesting to see how what was once the weakest part of the South for Republicans, which was the white working class areas, have now become the strongest part of the South for the GOP. What was once the weakest part for the Democrats, which was the suburban areas, as well as the Black Belt, are now their strongest areas. So anyway, thank you guys for watching this video, and make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel.